Current affairs to art, science and culture. The documentary from the BBC World Service tells the world's stories. Search for The Documentary wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Welcome to the Witness History podcast from the BBC World Service. Today, we're taking you back to November 1957, when the first living creature was sent into orbit around the Earth. That space pioneer was a Russian stray dog called Laika. In 2017, Olga Smirnova spoke to someone who knew the space dog well.
She was a very patient dog, very affectionate. She was easy to train. She was considered very clever. She had very expressive dark eyes.
Professor Viktor Yazdovsky was 9 in 1957. His father, Vladimir Yazdovsky, was a doctor and an engineer in charge of the medical side of the Soviet space program.
Everybody was very worried for her. There were no systems at the time capable of returning living creatures from the Earth's orbit. Everyone treated her as a hero.
And just before the flight, Viktor Yazdovsky's father gave Laika a special treat.
My father brought her to my granny's house not far from Moscow, and my sisters and I played with her. Dad thought that she needed this experience of being at home before the flight.
Soviet scientists had started thinking about sending dogs into space in 1948, and the Yazdovsky children often played with the experimental animals.
I remember that very often a car would arrive from my father's lab. It would signal, beep, beep, the door would open and a crowd of dogs would tumble out of it, barking, wagging their tails. They would rush into the clearing in the wood near the house. They would run to us, start licking us. Then they were fed. And then a command was given. They were well trained and they went back to the car and were driven back to the labs.
Sputnik II has been launched. A multi-stage rocket with a fuel more powerful than anything the West has in stock puts its final stage into a round-the-world orbit. Two things are astonishing about Sputnik II. Its weight, more than half a ton, and its live passenger, Laika, the most famous husky in the world, or strictly speaking, out of it.
Laika was incorrectly identified as a husky in news reports at the time. In fact, the Russian researchers like Vladimir Yazdovsky had made a conscious decision to use stray dogs, mongrels, for their experiments.
They decided to train not pedigree dogs, but street dogs for the space program. The strongest survived. They were homeless. Why were they selected? Because they had stamina and were undemanding. They were naturally selected by their life on the streets.
But not every stray dog qualified for the space program.
The requirement was that the dogs should weigh no more than 6 to 7 kilograms. They had to be white, as the scientists needed to photograph them remotely, and it was easier to photograph a white dog.
But why didn't Soviet scientists use monkeys the way the Americans were doing? After all, they appear to be closer to humans.
It was clear then that when monkeys had been launched up in rockets, there were frequent failures. Some had heart attacks. If they were launched under anesthetic, the information that was sent back to Earth would be incomplete and distorted. If they were to send smaller animals like mice or rats, how could you apply what you learned to humans and future human flight into space? I don't even mention small flies that the Americans tried to send into space.
There was one more reason for choosing dogs. They had already been studied extensively by the Russian scientist Pavlov.
The physiology of dogs was very well known to Soviet scientists. The great Russian scientist Pavlov studied the circulation system of dogs, their digestion and higher nervous activity of dogs. He received the Nobel Prize for this research.
Laika's elliptical orbit varies from 100 to 1,000 miles above the Earth's surface, where observatories listen eagerly for the coded radio signals which tell the space scientists how Laika is standing up to her lonely journey.
My father operated on Laika before the flight. In order to study Laika's blood pressure and monitor her pulse during the flight, my father pulled her main artery close to the surface of her skin. A transmitter was then attached to the artery. More transmitters were attached to her ribs and neck. They showed breathing rate and her general behavior.
In those conditions of weightlessness, how do you give a dog water or feed it?
Laika had 7 days' supply of food with her. They had invented special food for her. They had to work out what to do with water, as water just flies in conditions of weightlessness. They decided to make a special gel. It was made by hand. They ground and mashed meat for her and mixed it with water in necessary proportions for good nutrition. And they put it into a special tube.
And so, how did Laika's flight go?
Her first 4 orbits around the Earth were registered and all information transmitted to Earth. After 10 hours, difficulties started, and she died from overheating. The system of thermal insulation of her capsule had not been properly developed.
So she was effectively cooked.
Well, I don't know. I don't want to use this word about the doggy. She perished from overheating. She was a living being and she couldn't survive when her internal body temperature rose over 41 degrees Celsius.
November 1957 was the anniversary of the Russian Revolution, and the Soviet authorities wanted a big announcement to coincide with the date.
Because it was the 40th anniversary of the revolution in 1957, and they needed to make a push before the festivities. That's why not everything could be thought through in this flight preparation. Our competitors in the space race were, of course, the Americans. They constantly followed what we did. There was also a military component to this program because of the arms race. It also had to do with prestige. Khrushchev was the Soviet Communist Party leader then, and he needed to show Americans who was first.
So Laika the street dog found herself caught up in the space race. After her death, she became a Soviet celebrity.
In memory of this remarkable flight, special cigarettes and matches were produced in the USSR, called Laika. There were also special stamps and envelopes with Laika's image. The monument was unveiled in 2008 in Moscow. It's 2 meters high. The lower part shows a rocket, which turns into a palm of a hand, and a dog stands in this palm. Laika showed that a living creature could be alive in conditions of weightlessness. After Laika, my father continued working on the program of sending dogs on Sputniks. For example, the dogs Belka and Strelka, who went into space on 19th of August 1960. They returned to Earth alive and proved that it would be possible for a man to go into space. They were launched into space by the same rockets that later put the first man, Gagarin, into space. Laika was a truly heroic dog.
Viktor Yazdovsky was speaking to Olga Smirnova for that edition of the Witness History podcast, first broadcast in 2017. If you want to hear more programmes like this, go to bbcworldservice.com/Witness History.
Exploring the events shaping our lives through original documentary storytelling.
We'll hear arguments Roe against Wade.
The documentary from the BBC World Service is a window onto the wider world.
The security situation in Europe has changed in the last couple of years dramatically.
Search for the documentary wherever you get your BBC podcasts.